I'm very honored to be here representing FAO. I think this is going to be a very interesting experience for me as well, and to pass your messages to our organization. First of all, let me say that I will not be talking about science and technology. I will be talking more about the global aquaculture governance. How is aquaculture today? What are the challenges? And what is the scenario or the background to implement science and technology? So I will very briefly talk about the global aquaculture status and trends, the relevant issues of food and nutrition, the fish required for now and for the future, the main challenges, and I will talk more about the ecosystem approach to aquaculture and some of the elements that are behind this initiative. And I will finalize talking about a new initiative we are pursuing in FAO that's called the Blue Growth Initiative. I think it's very important to realize that the world hunger and undernourishment has improved, and this is a good thing, and sometimes we fail to recognize that. You can see in the upper figure, for example, the case of sub-Saharan Africa, the situation in the 90s, the situation today, and this is the Millennium Development Goal target. So we are still far from the target, but we are moving slowly. You can also see, for example, the situation of Southern Asia, and you can see as well something similar. In the case of Southeastern Asia, you can see that we have moved very, very efficiently. We are going already beyond the target. So different regions have a different situation, and clearly we need to put more emphasis, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, in some places in Asia and Latin America. Of course, when we talk about fish, we often talk about or think about protein, but fish is much more than protein. And indeed, I think the general public does not understand this very well in many regions of the world. Japan is probably an exception because you have a very high fish consumption per person, but this is not the case in many places, as I said, around the world. And of course, fish as protein is the main source of protein for many developing countries. For example, I put the example here of Bangladesh, where I've been working a lot in the past year, and several places in Africa, for example. And you can see here the share of fish in animal protein. And you can see, for example, that the share is very important in Africa, even though the per capita consumption is still small. But in some countries in Africa, it's practically the only real good source of protein. Of course, the situation, again, in Asia, Oceania and Asia is very good, but in other regions like in Latin America and the Caribbean, we still eat very, very little, very few fish. So in general, the main message here is that fish is important. It's a very important source of food. And this is a message we still need to communicate more to general public, and also to governance and to countries in general. And the other interesting news, you already know that, of course, is that aquaculture in a very exponential way is supplying more than half of the food fish global population consumes today. And you can see, and this situation will probably continue. And as a result of that, for example, in 2009, the Fisheries Department in FAO changed the name to Fisheries and Aquaculture Department. And even though we are still fewer professionals in aquaculture than in fisheries, the relevance of aquaculture is increasing in a very important way. Here we have a general picture obtained in 2013, and I should say FAO statistics are usually 2 years behind, because it's not easy to collect the information about production from all the countries. We make a big effort trying to collect reliable information. So we are just finishing the global statistics that will come with our every 2 years publication, the SOFIA State of the World Fisheries and Aquaculture. And so the best information we have is for 2013. And you can see we have 97 million tons and is distributed, as you see here. Freshwater fish production and inland aquaculture is still the largest contributor. And it's also the largest contributor to food security. So the importance of freshwater fish is absolutely relevant globally and especially in Asia. Aquatic plants are also very important. However, FAO does not consider yet aquatic plants within the food source because in general they are using more for other products than for food. This is another interesting figure that in a way reflects what I just mentioned, the production of finfish. The largest proportion is still inland aquaculture, mollusks of course in marine and aquatic plants. So here we still have a real challenge. The marine environment still being exploited very, very little regarding the production of fish. Aquatic plants, again, are very important, but even from the livelihoods perspective, one of the main challenges is that seaweed farmers get very little money, very little pay in producing aquatic plants. So this is an important challenge. And of course, Asia is the most important region in aquaculture. You can see the relevance is increasing through the years. Europe is also relevant, especially through salmon and some bivalves. The Americas you can see here, but in general, Asia keeps being the most relevant region. However, the potential for aquaculture in the other regions, especially in Africa and in Latin America, is huge. Of course in Europe, but there are other restrictions that we will discuss in a minute. Sorry. FAO has been making some projections together with the World Bank and with other organizations regarding the fish supply demand gaps by 2030, and now we are making projections all the way to 2050. And essentially, we have a supply and a demand, and we have a gap. Of course, the largest gap will be in Asia, considering the demand as it is today, and considering the increasing growth of the middle class with more fish demand. So we will have an important gap in terms of 1 million tons of fish at the global level. So this is a big challenge, and if we think about the growth rate of aquaculture today, that is going to stabilize, it's already stabilizing globally around 4%, will not be enough to supply this fish demand. That we will need at least 5.6, and we believe around 6% annual growth rate in order to fulfill this demand. So this is a challenge, and we are discussing at global level and at regional level how to deal with this challenge. Of course, there are several issues, and one of the most important issues and one of the major bottlenecks of aquaculture is the feed. And of course, you know, we have the two extreme cases for feeding, fed fish, of course, and non-fed aquaculture like filter feeders or algae. And of course, fed fish means that you have to find the source of feed. And this has an economic cost and also an environmental cost. And this is one of the great challenges. As you know, in most cases, in order to feed these fish, you have to go through a whole food web. However, there are some interesting and good news. The percentage of the total fish meal in use is being stabilized, and here you have the percentage of the total aqua feed. And in general, we know that the fish meal being used will not be able to increase, so certainly there are many efforts to find feed sources in terrestrial products and also to make the feeding more efficient. Nevertheless, the pressure over fish meal is stable, and if aquaculture continues to grow, even though smaller proportion of fish meal is being used, this is going to continue to be a challenge. And in this figure, you can see the global consumption of fish meal, and you can see, of course, the marine shrimp, marine fish, salmonids, they take about 57%, but the rest is all taken by the freshwater species. Even though the use of fish meal per ton is smaller because they are also omnivorous, yet the total use is increasing. So this is a big pressure over fish meal. This is, of course, a big challenge, because if something goes wrong with fish meal, for example, right now, the El Niño event might increase the pressure on the resource. The production of anchovy in the coast of Peru continues to decrease, so the price of fish meal will continue to increase, and this is going to most likely leave many small farmers out of business, and this is already happening in many places in the world. So we asked the question whether will the oceans help to feed humanity. We wrote this paper several years ago because we believe that the oceans should be able to provide much more food, and aquaculture in the future probably should grow much more in the marine environment. But again, one of the greatest challenges is to find fish feed sources on microalgae or some way that is easy to produce and that cannot rely on fresh water. Because even if today we are moving to freshwater sources, terrestrial sources of feeds like soybean, lupin, and corn, these products will rely on fresh water, and fresh water will continue to be a bottleneck in the future, especially under climate change. However, one of the other important issues is that the percentage of non-fed fish is decreasing. You can see the figures for China between 1980 and 2011. There used to be much more non-fed fish, like mussels, for example, and the carps that are not fed. But today you see a very strong trend to increasing the fed fish, because in general you have faster growing species, and also because the demand for the higher carnivore species is increasing as the consumption power and the capacity to buy fish increase. You can see, however, the bivalve production is increasing, and this is important, but the growth of the fed species is faster than those that are not fed. And so again, the message there is that perhaps we have to also do some work with consumers and to try to focus more on incentives for the consumption of non-fed species, and this is also an important challenge. But the other thing here is that if you see the growth of mariculture, here we have a 10-year prospect, and of course freshwater farming is growing faster. Mariculture used to be 41% of the total production of food fish by 2004. It's only 36% in 2013. So mariculture is not growing fast enough for this future where we need more fish produced in the marine environment. And we have to look at the reasons why this is the case. We have a code, the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, and this was adopted by countries in 1995. and it has an article, Article 9, that provides the guidance for sustainable aquaculture development. And the FAO is helping countries to implement this article of the code to make aquaculture really sustainable. We also try to evaluate how are the countries doing in implementing the code. And we do this every 2 years. We have a very specific questionnaire, and we ask questions about the implementation of the code. And the last reporting, we have a good report from 71 countries, 90% of the global production. And we can see here some scores on how well are the countries doing with different norms and regulations. For example, Codex Alimentarius, the food safety, are being very well complied, and there are good efforts on that. Also with the registration of farms, user rights. But if you go to the lower end of this figure, those scores that are not so good include, for example, regulations regarding feeds, stocking for example, culture-based fisheries, very little done about carrying capacity of ecosystems, very little done about escapes, and very little done about aquaculture zoning. So we still have very important areas for improvement from the regulation and governance perspective. So there are some urgent solutions for aquaculture to meet the challenge at global level. And availability of feed is probably one of the most important. Certainly, we need to focus more on mariculture development. We need to look at feeds that originate in the sea. This is a major challenge, and today some of the major feed companies are really making progress. We had a meeting last month with Biomar in Central America, and we saw very interesting progress in trying to use microalgae. The farming of non-fed species, but we need to increase the demand, so we need to work on the market. Culture-based fisheries, how we can do restocking and ranching, and we have a big challenge, especially regarding biosecurity and protection of biodiversity. Here we have a huge challenge and a lot to do. Significant improvement in the feed conversion ratio, especially in freshwater species. We can really do a lot in improving the feed use efficiency. Increase the resiliency of the sector under climate change and other threats. Improve technologies and management. Better area management involving carrying capacity, and empower small farmers. All of these, of course, require science and technology, but implementation is absolutely crucial. These first 3 or 4 are more related to global aquaculture governance, and we really need concerted actions. And these ones are more related to the on-the-ground implementation. How do we work with farmer communities? And here is where we are trying to do the ecosystem approach to aquaculture implementation. Well, you all know that aquaculture is a process, it's a production process, whether the feeds come from outside or the feeds are within the environment. And so it's so important to know how much is coming in and source, where it's coming from, and how much is going out and where. It's not only fish biomass, but we are releasing many things in the environment that are not coming out with the fish. So the ecosystem approach and the ecosystem perspective is absolutely needed. This represents essentially the figure we use in our guidelines to the ecosystem approach to aquaculture. I should mention that these guidelines and some of the most important initial steps that we have done with the FAO were funded by the Japanese government. So the guidelines, for example, were produced as an initiative that was strongly supported by Japan. The ecosystem approach to aquaculture is a strategy, and it's a strategy for the integration of the activity within the wider ecosystem in such a way that promotes sustainable development, equity, this is a very important word here, and resilience of interlinked social and ecological systems. The ecosystem approach to aquaculture is guided by 3 principles. Aquaculture should be developed in the context of ecosystem functions and services, with no degradation of these beyond their resilience. Aquaculture should improve human well-being and equity for all relevant stakeholders. And aquaculture should be developed in the context of other sector policies and goals as appropriate. We really need to make better efforts to insert aquaculture in the coastal zone and in the watersheds, in better integration with other users. This approach can be used at any geographical scale. The farm, when it's a large farm, the watershed, the national scale, the regional and the global scale. Often we have more problems here because relevant watersheds are shared by different countries, and sometimes we have to work at the international level in managing this approach. There are some important elements on the ecosystem approach to aquaculture that are different from the conventional approach. For example, the typical conventional approach is top-down. The ecosystem approach is very participatory. This one is production, and in case of the ecosystem approach, we have multiple objectives. It's not only production, but there are social and economic objectives. The typical sector is sectorial, and in the ecosystem approach, we have interactions. The farm scale is the most common one in the conventional approach. In the ecosystem approach, we have multiple scales. It is adaptive, extended knowledge. We really use the local knowledge as well. It's based on incentives rather than on prescriptions. It's public and transparent. The key element of the ecosystem approach is to balance the 3 objectives for any aquaculture planning and implementation. So we have to balance the ecological well-being objectives, the human well-being objectives, and the governance. And this is quite difficult. We can write this, we can talk about this, but in general, it's challenging, it's difficult. It's difficult because it's difficult to reconcile these 3 objectives. They are always trade-offs. Normally, we want economic outcomes, optimizing economic benefits to the community with potential for social development. And when we go to Africa, to Latin America, this is exactly what the governments want. Food security is normally a very important one. Maintaining ecosystem services is relevant, is important, but it's very often left to second place. Okay, we will worry about that later, but when we talk about later, it's often too late. So it's quite difficult to really balance these objectives because in time there are trade-offs, and we have to be very aware about these trade-offs. I will not go into the detail, but ecosystem approach to fisheries and to aquaculture, because we use it both, and very often we have to work with both fisheries and aquaculture together because they interact a lot in common places. But in general, we have to have an initiation and planning, and here it's very important to develop what we call a baseline document or information. We identify and prioritize the most important issues, and we use risk assessment. Risk assessment is very relevant. By using risk assessment, we identify the most relevant issues. We cannot deal with everything at the same time. We have to focus on some issues that are more important. So risk assessment is key, and then we develop a management system, and for each priority problem, we develop some operational objectives and management approaches. We implement and monitoring, and then this is of course a revolving system, and we can do this at different levels or scales. But we have found out that this works better when we work at local scale. We can really work with communities around this ecosystem approach. Typically, we use what we call issue trees, trying to understand the relevant issues that we have to address. And this could be related to the ecological well-being, so issues that could be dealing with the inputs and resource use, outputs, and other effects on the ecosystem. issues and opportunities related to social and economic well-being, farmer income, local community, national level, and the governance and external drivers. And here, of course, we have climate change. Climate change is being an important external driver, and now we have to put also that in our management plan. When we go into more detail, we can focus on the ecological and social well-being, and typically some of the most relevant inputs issues are related, for example, with feeds, with labor, the use of coastal habitats, and in the outputs some of the unwanted products like organic matter, escapees, genes, parasites, etc. In October, we had a meeting in Vigo where we discussed with the global community the aquaculture perceptions, because there are lots of issues with aquaculture perceptions. There are lots of misperceptions in many places in the world, but some misperceptions are guided by these issues. And so some of the most important environmental issues we've already discussed is, for example, fish to feed fish. But we have to recognize that there have been relevant improvements in some species and systems. For example, in salmon, salmon is probably one of the species that have the strongest reduction on the feed conversion ratio. And in some cases, it's very close to 1.1, 1.2. Yet, this is not the case for many of the other species. So there is a lot to learn and a lot of for example, technologies and management that could be transferred. And we are now making a major effort at the global level to focus on the feed conversion factor. Not only because the feed, but also because the side effects, for example, greenhouse emissions and nutrient exports and so on. Another issue used to be the mangrove clearance and deterioration due to aquaculture, but most mangrove clearance already took place in the past decade. Now the trend is increasing efficiency, and there are also some restoration efforts. And we are seeing some improvement, and this is very, very good news that we can communicate. Food safety in general is improving dramatically. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's improving mostly for exports and not so much for national consumption. And we are dealing with this in several countries, but again, we believe there are important improvements. In the case of diseases, although there are relevant improvements, disease keeps being one of the most important challenges in aquaculture. There are important improvements, but we really need to make more efforts for implementation of broader biosecurity at all scales, and this really needs attention. Organic matter and eutrophication continues to be a problem, especially in Asia, where aquaculture is more densely packed and the intensification is occurring. And here we will have to put more attention. With escapes from aquaculture, there is a lot of attention to this in the Americas or in Europe, for example, related to salmon, and a little bit about tilapia, but very little is being done in Asia. So we really don't have enough information, we don't know enough about the impact of escapes from aquaculture in natural ecosystems. And we will have to worry more about this. Of course, as you know, the first law of thermodynamics matters. The matter doesn't disappear, it only transforms. So we always have to remember that, and nutrients and organic matter really do not disappear. They accumulate or they go somewhere, and we have to know where is it going, and we have to be very aware of that. We cannot forget, and this could be a serious problem in many places already. Of course, the ecosystem approach to aquaculture is using some of these ideas like integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, polyculture, facilitating the nutrient recycling. But this is good at the experimental level. We don't see this being implemented in a massive way. even though integrated aquaculture at the landscape level takes place in China and in other places, very rarely one farmer that is growing is going to put more attention than to one species. So we need to see how we can increase incentives for these integrated approaches. Social issues are also important in aquaculture. We hear this in the news very often. Very often there are not enough benefits for local communities, like permanent labor and services. Although there are good examples, we need to increase the participation of the local community in the aquaculture processes. Inequity is a very important one. The lack of equity in the distribution of income, salaries, this is very relevant.